The restaurant was alive with the hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware against fine china, and the rich aroma of gourmet dishes wafting from the kitchen. Andrew Miller, a seasoned waiter, expertly navigated the crowded floor. His crisp white shirt and black tie were immaculate despite the long shift, and his ever-present smile radiated professionalism. He prided himself on being able to handle even the most demanding customers, but tonight would test his patience and dignity in ways he could never have imagined. At a corner table, Jason Parker reclined in his chair, his expensive suit barely concealing the air of entitlement that surrounded him. Jason's name was synonymous with success, a self-made millionaire, as the tabloids proclaimed, though whispers in the business world hinted otherwise. Accompanied by a few equally pretentious associates, Jason dominated the room with his booming laughter and dismissive remarks. Andrew had already noted their table's high-maintenance demands, but he approached with his usual calm demeanor. "Gentlemen," Andrew greeted with a warm smile, placing a fresh bottle of wine on the table. "Here's the Chateau Margaux you ordered. Would you like me to pour it for you?" Jason barely glanced up, too engrossed in a story about his latest business acquisition. One of his friends, a young executive clearly trying to impress, nodded. Andrew began pouring with steady hands, but before he could finish, Jason interrupted. "Is that how you pour a $2,000 bottle of wine?" Jason's voice cut through the din of the restaurant. Heads turned. "You're wasting half of it." Startled, Andrew paused. "I apologize, sir." "Oh." Jason snatched the bottle from Andrew's hand, spilling a few drops on the pristine white tablecloth. "You think I'm paying for sloppy service like this? Do you know who I am?" Andrew straightened, his calm exterior cracking under the weight of Jason's condescension. "I assure you, sir, I'll make this right." Jason leaned back in his chair, his smirk infuriatingly smug. "Make it right? You're a waiter, not a miracle worker. Maybe try doing your job properly next time." The humiliation stung. Andrew felt the heat rise to his cheeks as Jason's friends laughed, their amusement as sharp as the sting of Jason's words. The diners at nearby tables pretended not to notice, though their furtive glances betrayed their discomfort. "I'll fetch you another bottle immediately," Andrew said, his voice tight with suppressed frustration. He turned to leave, but Jason wasn't finished. "Wait," Jason barked. "You think you can just walk away after ruining my night? I want to speak to the manager." The manager, a balding man named Mr. Everett, arrived within moments. His expression was apologetic as he approached Jason's table, bowing slightly as though trying to placate a king. Jason wasted no time embellishing the story, painting Andrew as incompetent and careless. Andrew tried to interject, but Mr. Everett raised a hand to silence him. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Parker," Mr. Everett said, his tone dripping with obsequiousness. "I assure you we'll handle this matter immediately." Andrew stood frozen as Mr. Everett turned to him, his face dark with disapproval. "Andrew, we'll discuss this in the back. Now." The walk to the staff room felt like a march to the gallows. As the door closed behind them, Mr. Everett rounded on him. "What were you thinking? We can't afford to lose a client like Jason Parker." Andrew's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, sir, he was being unreasonable. I did my best to—" "Your best wasn't good enough," Mr. Everett snapped. "Do you know how many complaints we've had about you tonight? None until now. And now, we have one from the most important table in the house." Andrew stared at the floor, his fists clenched at his sides. "I didn't do anything wrong." "That doesn't matter," Mr. Everett said coldly. "What matters is that Mr. Parker is unhappy. Pack your things. You're done here." For a moment Andrew couldn't move. The weight of the words crushed him, his mind racing through bills unpaid and the job applications he'd already sent out in desperation. He needed this job. "Sir, please," he said, his voice cracking. "I've worked here for 3 years. You know 3 years, and you still don't know how to handle a high-profile client," Mr. Everett interrupted. "You'll be paid for tonight, but I need your uniform turned in before you leave." Andrew left the room, his vision blurred with anger and shame. He felt the eyes of his co-workers on him as he returned to the floor to gather his things. Jason's laughter rang out across the room, a final insult to injury. Standing outside in the cool night air, Andrew clutched his bag tightly. The bustling city lights felt mocking now, a stark contrast to the darkness creeping into his thoughts. For the first time in years he felt utterly powerless. But beneath the despair, a spark of resolve began to grow. Andrew had spent years swallowing his pride, enduring hardships for the sake of survival. He wasn't about to let Jason Parker be the reason he lost his dignity. As he walked toward the subway, he whispered to himself, "This isn't the end. Not for me. And though he didn't know it yet, the worst night of his life was about to set the stage for a transformation neither he nor Jason could have foreseen. The following weeks were grueling for Andrew. The sting of being fired still clung to him, a bitter reminder of how quickly everything could unravel. His severance pay was meager, barely enough to cover rent and basic expenses. Despite the hit to his pride, he scoured job listings daily, determined to find work before his savings ran dry. But nothing came easily. His restaurant experience seemed worthless outside of the service industry, and the rejections piled up. Each "we regret to inform you" email felt like another nail in the coffin of his confidence. One evening, as he sifted through postings on a dimly lit laptop, a headline caught his eye: Nursing Assistant Certification Program, Start a Rewarding Career in Healthcare. He clicked out of curiosity, scanning the requirements. The program wasn't cheap, but it offered flexible payment plans and a fast track to employment. Andrew leaned back in his chair, the idea swirling in his mind. He'd always admired the care and precision of the medical professionals he'd encountered during his mother's illness years ago. At the time, they had been a source of strength and calm during the chaos of hospital visits and treatments. Could this be a path forward? After a sleepless night of deliberation, Andrew decided to take the plunge. He enrolled in the program, using most of his remaining savings for the deposit. It felt like a gamble, but one he had to take. The training was intense. Andrew juggled long hours of coursework with hands-on clinical practice at a nearby hospital. The physical demands were exhausting, moving patients, cleaning up after them, and managing the relentless pace of a hospital floor. But the work carried a sense of purpose that buoyed him through the toughest days. His classmates were a diverse group, ranging from recent high school graduates to middle-aged career changers. Andrew quickly bonded with a few of them, finding solace in their shared determination to succeed. "You're a natural at this," said Samantha, a fellow trainee, as they practiced taking vital signs during a lab session. "You're so calm with the patients." Andrew smiled faintly. "I think it's just years of dealing with difficult customers. Turns out those skills translate pretty well." "Still, not everyone has the patience for this kind of work," Samantha replied. "You're going to make a great nursing assistant?" Andrew didn't know how to respond. The words were encouraging, but doubt still lingered. He had spent so long identifying himself by his previous job that imagining a future in healthcare felt surreal. After 3 grueling months, Andrew completed the program and earned his certification. The hospital where he had trained offered him a position almost immediately, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of stability. His first day as an official nursing assistant was nerve-wracking. Dressed in crisp scrubs, he entered the bustling medical surgical floor, his ID badge gleaming with his name: Andrew Miller, CNA. The charge nurse, a brisk but kind woman named Denise, gave him a quick tour. "This is a tough floor," Denise said as they passed a row of patient rooms. "You'll be on your feet all day and the patients can be demanding. But if you stay focused and work hard, you'll do fine." Andrew nodded, absorbing her words like a sponge. His first few shifts were a blur of activity, adjusting 4 lines, changing linens, assisting patients with mobility, and documenting every interaction meticulously. The work was as challenging as it was rewarding. One patient in particular stood out to him, a frail elderly woman named Mrs. Hargrove, recovering from surgery. She rarely spoke, her cloudy eyes reflecting years of weariness. Most staff hurried through her room, treating her as just another task. But Andrew took extra time with her, ensuring she was comfortable and even coaxing a few words from her now and then. On his 4th day, Mrs. Hargrove grasped his hand as he adjusted her blanket. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're very kind." Andrew blinked, surprised by the lump rising in his throat. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he said softly, though her words stayed with him long after he left her room. The weeks passed, and Andrew found himself adapting to the rhythm of hospital life. His days were filled with small victories, calming anxious patients, earning the trust of skeptical colleagues, and mastering the intricacies of patient care. For the first time since his firing, he felt a sense of belonging. Yet challenges persisted. Some days were physically and emotionally draining, leaving him questioning whether he was cut out for this line of work. He missed the simplicity of waiting tables, where the worst he had to deal with was a demanding customer or a bad tip. But those moments of doubt were outweighed by the satisfaction of making a difference, however small. Andrew realized he was growing, not just as a professional but as a person. The hospital was shaping him, giving him a purpose beyond survival. One particularly hectic afternoon, Andrew was called to assist with a new patient being wheeled into the ward. The nurse handed him the chart, and his heart skipped a beat when he read the name, Jason Parker. For a moment he froze. It couldn't be the same Jason Parker who had upended his life weeks ago. But as the gurney rolled into view, Andrew's suspicions were confirmed. There he was, the same smug face now pale and drawn, his arm in a cast and his leg immobilized. Andrew's thoughts raced. Part of him wanted to walk away, to let someone else handle this man who had treated him with such cruelty. But a voice inside him, perhaps his better self, held him back. This was his job now, and he wouldn't let anyone compromise his integrity. Swallowing his pride, Andrew stepped forward. "Mr. Parker," he said, his tone professional, "welcome to our floor. I'll be one of the assistants helping with your care." Jason's eyes flickered open, hazy with medication. He didn't seem to recognize Andrew, which was both a relief and a strange disappointment. Andrew wasn't sure what he had expected. A moment of reckoning, perhaps? But there was none. Instead, Andrew focused on the task at hand. As he settled Jason into his room and reviewed his care plan, he reminded himself of the vow he had made, to never let anyone strip him of his dignity again. Whether Jason remembered him or not didn't matter. Andrew would do his job with the same care and compassion he showed every patient. As he closed the door to Jason's room and moved on to his next task, Andrew felt an odd sense of calm. Life had a way of coming full circle, and though he didn't know what lay ahead, he was determined to face it head-on. The hospital was alive with its usual energy, the hum of machines, the steady murmur of conversations, and the hurried footsteps of medical staff. Andrew was midway through his shift when Denise, the charge nurse, approached him with an update. "Room 314 needs assistance," Denise said, scanning her clipboard. "New patient. Car accident. He's stable but in a lot of pain. Orthopedic injuries, leg fracture and some rib damage." Andrew nodded, already mentally preparing himself. Room 314 wasn't on his regular rounds, but he was used to being called in where needed. With a deep breath, he gathered supplies and headed toward the room. As he entered, the patient's identity hit him like a lightning bolt. Jason Parker lay in the hospital bed, his face pale and drawn, his arm in a sling, and his leg encased in a heavy cast. His sharp features, so filled with arrogance the last time Andrew had seen him, now looked hollow and fatigued. Andrew froze for a split second, the memory of his firing flashing vividly in his mind. But his training kicked in and he forced his emotions aside. This was a professional setting and Jason was just another patient. Nothing more. Jason stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked a few times, disoriented, before his gaze landed on Andrew. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by confusion. "You?" Jason's voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Do I know you?" Andrew forced a neutral expression. "I'm Andrew Miller, your nursing assistant. I'll be helping with your care." Jason squinted at him, his mind clearly trying to piece things together. Andrew felt the weight of the moment but didn't let it linger. He moved to adjust the 4 and check Jason's vitals. "You look familiar," Jason muttered, wincing as he shifted slightly. "Have we met before?" "We have," Andrew replied, his tone steady. "I used to work at the restaurant where you dined a few weeks ago." Jason's brows furrowed as the memory clicked into place. His lips parted, but no words came out. Andrew could almost see the gears turning in Jason's mind, recalling the scene he had caused. After a long silence, Jason finally spoke. I didn't realize you weren't working there anymore." Andrew met his gaze briefly, his expression unreadable. "That's correct. I left shortly after." Jason's eyes dropped, his discomfort palpable. But Andrew wasn't here to dig up old wounds. He focused on his work, moving efficiently and professionally despite the tension in the room. Over the next few days, Andrew's interactions with Jason remained cordial but distant. He performed his duties with precision, ensuring Jason's comfort without engaging in unnecessary conversation. Jason, for his part, seemed uncharacteristically subdued, his usual bravado replaced by quiet reflection. One afternoon, as Andrew entered the room to change Jason's linens, he found his patient staring out the window, lost in thought. Jason didn't look up as Andrew worked, but after a few moments he spoke. "I was a real jerk to you, wasn't I?" Andrew paused, his hands stilling on the bed linens. He looked at Jason, who still hadn't turned around. "You were," Andrew replied honestly but without malice. "But that's in the past." Jason finally turned to face him, his expression somber. "I didn't mean for you to lose your job." Andrew shrugged. Intentions don't always matter when actions speak louder. Jason flinched at the bluntness of Andrew's words but nodded slowly. "I guess I deserve that." Andrew finished his task and turned to leave, but Jason's voice stopped him. "Why are you still being nice to me?" Jason asked, his tone tinged with genuine curiosity. "If it were me, I'd probably hold a grudge." Andrew hesitated, weighing his words. "Because holding on to anger doesn't help anyone. My job is to care for my patients, regardless of what's happened in the past." Jason fell silent, his gaze dropping to his lap. Andrew left the room, his emotions a whirlwind. He had expected bitterness when faced with Jason again, but instead, he felt an odd sense of clarity. The hospital had taught him to separate people from their actions, to see vulnerability even in those who had wronged him. As the days turned into weeks, Jason's injuries began to heal, though the road to recovery was slow. Physical therapy sessions left him frustrated, and the pain made him irritable. But Andrew remained patient, guiding him through exercises and encouraging him when he felt like giving up. One afternoon, during a particularly challenging session, Jason let out a groan of frustration. "This is pointless. I'll never get back to where I was." Andrew knelt beside him, steadying his leg brace. "You will. It's going to take time and effort, but you'll get there." Jason glared at him, his pride clearly bruised. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one stuck in this bed." Andrew stood, meeting Jason's gaze. "You're right. I'm not. But I know what it's like to feel powerless. You don't have to stay there. It's your choice to keep moving forward." Jason's expression softened, and for the first time, Andrew saw a crack in his defenses. "You're a lot more patient than I deserve," Jason admitted quietly. Andrew smiled faintly. "Maybe. But this isn't about what you deserve. It's about helping you get better." As Jason's recovery progressed, he began to open up to Andrew in small but meaningful ways. He shared bits of his life. His rise to success, the pressure to maintain his image, and the toll it had taken on his relationships. Andrew listened without judgment, offering insights when asked but never overstepping. One evening, as Andrew adjusted Jason's medication, Jason surprised him with a question. "What made you choose this job?" Andrew paused, considering his response. "It wasn't my first choice," he admitted. "But it's given me a sense of purpose I didn't know I needed." Jason studied him, his expression contemplative. "You seem different. Like you've got it all figured out." Andrew chuckled. "Trust me, I don't. But I've learned that life is less about having all the answers and more about making the most of the moments we're given." Jason nodded, his gaze distant. "Maybe I need to figure that out too." By the end of his stay, Jason had begun to regain some of his strength, though his physical and emotional scars remained. On his last day in the hospital, as Andrew helped him into a wheelchair for discharge, Jason looked at him with a rare sincerity. "Andrew," he said, his voice steady, "thank you. Not just for taking care of me but for everything else." Andrew smiled, his demeanor warm but professional. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Parker." Jason hesitated, then extended his hand. Andrew took it, their handshake firm and unspoken understanding passing between them. As Jason was wheeled out of the hospital, Andrew watched him go, a mixture of relief and hope settling in his chest. Their paths had crossed again under unexpected circumstances, but perhaps this time, it was the beginning of something better. The weeks following Jason's discharge were quieter for Andrew, but his mind often drifted back to their encounters. He hadn't expected Jason to change overnight, but something about their conversations lingered, a small spark of vulnerability in the businessman's otherwise impenetrable armor. Then one rainy evening, while Andrew was heading home after a grueling shift, he spotted a familiar figure struggling to maneuver a crutch on the wet sidewalk. Jason Parker, clad in a dark hoodie and jeans, looked nothing like the arrogant tycoon Andrew had first encountered. For a moment, Andrew considered walking past, pretending not to notice. But something made him stop. "Jason," Andrew called out, stepping closer. Jason turned, his expression flickering with recognition and embarrassment. "Andrew," he said, his voice subdued. "Fancy meeting you here." Andrew glanced at the drenched sidewalk and Jason's awkward stance. "You need a hand?" he asked. Jason hesitated, clearly wrestling with his pride. But a sudden gust of wind sent him teetering and he sighed in defeat. "Yeah, I could use some help." Andrew moved quickly, steadying Jason and guiding him toward a nearby cafe. The warmth of the cafe was a welcome contrast to the cold rain outside. They found a corner table and Andrew ordered 2 coffees. Jason rubbed his hands together, avoiding Andrew's gaze. "Thanks for that," he muttered. "I'm not great with this." He gestured vaguely at his leg brace and crutch. Andrew studied him for a moment. "You don't have to be," he said simply. "Recovering from something like this isn't easy." Jason let out a dry laugh. "Easy? I don't even know what easy looks like anymore." As their coffee arrived, the conversation turned to more neutral topics. Jason spoke about his business, though his usual bravado was tempered by an uncharacteristic humility, and Andrew shared snippets of his work at the hospital. "You really seem to like it," Jason said, sipping his coffee. "Helping people, I mean." Andrew nodded. "It's fulfilling in ways I didn't expect. It's not just about the tasks, it's about connecting with people, even when they're at their worst." Jason smirked faintly. "You mean like me?" Andrew chuckled. "I wasn't going to say it." Jason's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "I owe you an apology," he said suddenly, "for what happened at the restaurant. I didn't think about how my actions would affect you. I'm sorry." The sincerity in Jason's voice caught Andrew off guard. For a moment he didn't know how to respond. "Thank you," he said finally. "That means a lot." Jason nodded, looking relieved. The tension between them seemed to ease, replaced by a tentative camaraderie. Their paths continued to cross in the weeks that followed. Jason began attending physical therapy sessions at the same hospital where Andrew worked, and though their interactions remained professional, a strange sort of friendship started to form. Jason's frustrations often boiled over during therapy, his impatience clashing with the slow pace of his recovery. One afternoon, Andrew found Jason in the hospital's small rehabilitation gym, muttering angrily as he struggled with an exercise band. His therapist had stepped away, leaving Jason to fend for himself. "This thing's useless," Jason growled, yanking at the band. "I'm wasting my time here." Andrew approached cautiously. "Need some help?" Jason glared at him but didn't refuse. Andrew adjusted the band, demonstrating the proper form. "It's not about speed," he said. "It's about consistency. Small steps lead to bigger ones." Jason grumbled but followed Andrew's instructions. After a few minutes, his scowl softened. "You're annoyingly good at this," he admitted grudgingly. Andrew shrugged. "Patience comes with the territory." Jason paused, his expression growing serious. "Where'd you learn that?" "Patience, I mean." Andrew hesitated, then said, "From my mom mostly. She was sick for a long time when I was younger. Watching her taught me that some things take time, no matter how hard you try to rush them." Jason didn't respond right away, his gaze distant. "That sounds tough." "It was," Andrew admitted. "But it also taught me to appreciate the small victories." Jason nodded slowly, his usual bravado replaced by a quiet respect. "Maybe I could learn a thing or two from you." Over time, Jason's walls began to crack. He shared snippets of his own struggles. His relentless drive to prove himself, the pressure to maintain an image of success, and the loneliness that came with it. Andrew listened without judgment, offering insights when appropriate but never pushing too hard. One evening, as Jason finished a particularly grueling therapy session, he turned to Andrew. "You know, I used to think people like you had it easy." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "People like me?" "People who work regular jobs, who don't have to deal with shareholders or cutthroat competition," Jason clarified. "But now I see it's not about what you do, it's about how you do it." Andrew smiled faintly. "And what have you learned?" Jason sighed. "That I've been doing it all wrong." The turning point came during an unplanned encounter outside the hospital. Andrew was sitting on a bench during his lunch break eating a sandwich when Jason approached, looking unusually pensive. "Mind if I join you?" Jason asked. Andrew gestured to the empty spot beside him. Jason sat down, uncharacteristically quiet. "I've been thinking," Jason began, staring at the horizon. "About what you said. About small victories." Andrew waited, sensing there was more. "I built my whole life on big wins," Jason continued. "Closing deals, buying companies, making money. But I've never stopped to appreciate the little things. Like this." He gestured around them at the simple beauty of the hospital courtyard. Andrew nodded. "It's not too late to start." Jason looked at him, something vulnerable in his eyes. "You really believe that?" "I do," Andrew said firmly. "But it's up to you to decide what you want to do with it." Jason fell silent, his gaze thoughtful. For the first time, Andrew felt that Jason was truly beginning to change. By the end of the week, Jason approached Andrew after one of his therapy sessions, a small smile on his face. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "Thanks for putting up with me." Andrew chuckled. "You're not as bad as you think." Jason shook his head. "Still, I appreciate it. I'd like to pay it forward somehow." Andrew tilted his head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Jason shrugged, a hint of his old confidence returning. "I don't know yet. But I want to figure it out." As Jason left, Andrew watched him go, a sense of satisfaction warming his chest. Jason still had a long way to go, but the cracks in his armor had turned into open windows. And for Andrew, that was more than enough. The rehabilitation center bustled with activity as patients shuffled through their routines, each at a different stage of recovery. Jason was in the corner, gripping a parallel bar with white-knuckled determination as he slowly shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His leg brace creaked slightly under the strain, and beads of sweat rolled down his face. Andrew observed from across the room, his trained eye catching every grimace and wobble. When Jason finally lowered himself onto a bench, his frustration was palpable. He pulled a towel from a nearby rack and scrubbed his face angrily. "This is pathetic," Jason muttered as Andrew approached. "I used to run marathons. Now I can barely stand." Andrew sat on the bench beside him, offering a bottle of water. "It's not about where you were, it's about where you're going." Jason glanced at him, his expression guarded. "Easy for you to say. You've probably never had to start over like this." Andrew hesitated, the memory of his dismissal from the restaurant still fresh. "More than you'd think," he replied. "But starting over doesn't mean you're finished. It just means you're building something new." Jason leaned back against the wall, letting Andrew's words sink in. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," Andrew admitted. "But focusing on the progress, not the setbacks, helps. Even small victories matter." As the days passed, Jason's recovery crept forward at an excruciatingly slow pace. Each minor improvement was met with frustration, and his temper flared more often than not. Andrew, who had become a steady presence during his therapy sessions, bore the brunt of Jason's irritation with surprising grace. One afternoon, Jason snapped after a failed attempt to lift his leg onto a therapy ball. "This is pointless," he barked, shoving the ball away. "What's the point of trying if I'm just going to keep failing?" Andrew calmly retrieved the ball and set it back in place. "The point is to keep going. You're not failing, you're learning." Jason scoffed. "Learning what? How useless I've become?" Andrew's patience wavered, but he refused to let Jason's bitterness consume the moment. "You're learning resilience," he said firmly. "And that's worth more than you realize." Jason didn't respond, but something in his expression softened. He picked up the ball again, his movements slower but more deliberate. Over time, Jason began to share more about his life during their conversations. His carefully crafted image of a self-made millionaire began to fray, revealing cracks in the facade. He spoke of long hours, endless pressure, and the relentless drive to prove himself in a world that rewarded cutthroat ambition. "I didn't come from money," Jason confessed one afternoon as he leaned against a wall, catching his breath. "I built everything from scratch. Worked my way up from nothing." Andrew nodded, sensing there was more. "That takes grit. But it also sounds lonely." Jason shrugged, his gaze distant. "It is. I've got people around me, partners, employees, even friends. But most of them wouldn't stick around if the money disappeared." Andrew leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So why keep doing it?" Jason hesitated, the question hanging heavily between them. "Because if I stop, what's left?" he asked quietly. Andrew's chest tightened at the vulnerability in Jason's voice. For a moment, he saw not the arrogant businessman who had humiliated him, but a man struggling to find meaning in his success. Their conversations grew deeper as Jason's recovery progressed. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Jason spoke about his estranged family. "My dad left when I was a kid," he said, staring at the floor. "And my mom, she tried but we barely made it. I promised myself I'd never struggle like that again." Andrew nodded, his tone gentle. "It sounds like you've been carrying that weight for a long time." Jason rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched into his features. "I thought money would fix it. But now, I don't even know what fixed looks like." Andrew hesitated, then offered a rare personal insight. "When my mom was sick, I spent years trying to fix things, her treatments, the bills, even my own emotions. But sometimes the best thing you can do is just be there. For yourself, for the people you care about." Jason looked at him, his brow furrowed. "How do you do that?" "Be there, I mean." Andrew smiled faintly. "One step at a time." As Jason continued to open up, Andrew noticed subtle shifts in his behavior. He was less combative during therapy, more willing to listen and reflect. He even started greeting the staff by name, a stark contrast to the aloof man who had arrived weeks earlier. One afternoon, Jason surprised Andrew with a question. "Do you ever regret leaving the restaurant?" Andrew considered the question carefully. "I didn't leave," he said evenly. "I was fired." Jason's face darkened with guilt. "Because of me?" "Partly," Andrew admitted. "But honestly, it was a blessing in disguise. I found something better, something that gave me a sense of purpose." Jason shook his head, his voice heavy with regret. I'm sorry. I didn't think about how my actions affected you. Andrew met his gaze, his expression calm. Apology accepted. But what matters now is what you do with what you've learned. Jason nodded slowly, the weight of Andrew's words settling on his shoulders. The turning point came during a quiet evening as Andrew helped Jason navigate the stairs outside the therapy center. The two men paused at the top, catching their breath. The city stretched out before them, its lights twinkling in the dusk. You ever think about second chances? Jason asked, his voice quiet. Every day, Andrew replied. Jason stared at the horizon, his jaw tightening. I think I need one. And not just for this. He gestured to his injured leg. For everything. Andrew smiled faintly. The good news is it's never too late to start over. Jason turned to him, his expression earnest. Thanks, Andrew. For putting up with me, for listening. For everything. Andrew clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm. You're welcome. But don't thank me yet. The real work's just beginning. As they descended the stairs together, Jason's determination shone brighter than the city lights. And for the first time, Andrew felt the seeds of hope taking root, not just for Jason but for the bond they had begun to forge. Jason Parker was a man of precision. At least, that was the image he had cultivated, strategic, decisive, always in control. But as he limped into the hospital's rehabilitation wing for another session, he couldn't deny that his life had become anything but controlled. The man who had once measured success by dollar signs now found himself counting steps, measuring progress in inches instead of miles. And somewhere along the way his perspective had started to shift. Andrew noticed the change almost immediately. Jason's demeanor, once sharp-edged and brimming with arrogance, had softened. He greeted staff members warmly, even cracking jokes with the nurses. His therapy sessions, once punctuated by bursts of frustration, were now marked by quiet determination. Nice work today, Andrew said as Jason finished a set of leg exercises. You're getting stronger. Jason wiped the sweat from his brow, his breathing steady. Thanks, he said, glancing at Andrew. You were right about the small victories. Andrew smiled. Told you they'd add up? That afternoon, Jason asked Andrew to join him for coffee in the hospital's courtyard. It wasn't an unusual request by now. The two men often found time to talk outside of therapy sessions. But this time, Jason seemed unusually pensive. I've been thinking about that night at the restaurant, Jason began, staring into his coffee cup. How I acted. How I treated you. Andrew sipped his coffee, waiting. Jason let out a heavy sigh. I was a jerk. Worse than a jerk. And I didn't just humiliate you, I cost you your job. I've been carrying that for weeks now and I need to say it. I'm sorry, Andrew. Andrew set his cup down, his expression thoughtful. Thank you, he said simply. That means a lot. Jason looked at him, his gaze steady. You're not going to tell me it's all water under the bridge, are you? Andrew shook his head. No. What you did hurt. But what matters now is that you're owning up to it. That's a step in the right direction. Jason nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of. But I want to change that. I want to do better. Jason's commitment to change became evident in small but meaningful ways. During his therapy sessions, he began encouraging other patients, sharing his own struggles to inspire them. One elderly man recovering from a hip replacement often sat next to Jason during their exercises. The two struck up an unlikely camaraderie, trading stories about their lives before their injuries. You know, the man said one morning, I didn't expect a guy like you to be so approachable. Jason laughed. A guy like me? The man shrugged. Rich. Important. The type who usually doesn't give people like me the time of day. Jason glanced at Andrew, who was nearby, and then back at the man. Let's just say I've had some good teachers lately. One evening, Jason approached Andrew with a surprising request. I want to do something for the hospital, he said. A donation or maybe a program for the patients here. Something that gives back. Andrew raised an eyebrow. That's a generous idea. Any particular reason? Jason hesitated, then said, because I've taken more than I've given in life. It's time to balance the scales. Andrew nodded, impressed. I think that's a great start. Jason's idea quickly gained momentum. He met with hospital administrators to discuss funding a new initiative to provide free physical therapy sessions for patients without insurance. The proposal was met with enthusiasm, and Jason threw himself into the project with a focus and passion Andrew had never seen before. The day the program was officially announced, Jason invited Andrew to join him at the small ceremony in the hospital's lobby. A modest crowd of staff and patients gathered as Jason stepped up to the podium. "When I first came here," Jason began, his voice steady, "I was angry, frustrated, and focused on all the wrong things. But this place, these people, changed me. They reminded me that life isn't about what you take, it's about what you give. This program is just a small way for me to give back to a community that gave me so much." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, and Andrew couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Jason had come a long way, and the man standing at the podium now was almost unrecognizable from the one who had walked into the hospital weeks ago. Later that evening, Andrew and Jason sat in the courtyard, the ceremony behind them. "You did good today," Andrew said, leaning back on the bench. Jason smirked. "Coming from you, that's high praise." Andrew chuckled. "Don't let it go to your head." Jason grew quiet, his expression contemplative. "You know, if someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be funding therapy sessions instead of closing business deals, I would have laughed in their face." Andrew smiled. "Life has a way of surprising you." Jason nodded. "And sometimes it gives you a second chance." As they parted ways that night, Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that Jason's transformation was more than just an act of redemption. It was a testament to the power of vulnerability and connection. Jason had been humbled, yes, but he had also found a sense of purpose that seemed to light him from within. For Andrew, seeing Jason's growth reaffirmed his own beliefs about resilience and the human capacity for change. And though their journey together was far from over, he felt certain they were both heading toward something better. The hospital lobby was quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by the subdued calm of late evening. Andrew was nearing the end of his shift when he received an unexpected call from the front desk. "Mr. Parker is asking for you," the receptionist said. "He's in the visitor lounge and he seems unsettled." Andrew frowned, his curiosity piqued. Jason had been discharged weeks ago and was making steady progress in outpatient therapy. He hadn't expected to see him back at the hospital so soon, let alone at this hour. Quickly tidying up his workstation, Andrew made his way to the lounge. Jason sat in the far corner, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something that looked suspiciously like worry. He was scrolling through his phone, his thumb moving restlessly across the screen. When he spotted Andrew, he stood, his movements a touch too hurried. "Thanks for coming," Jason said, his voice low. He glanced around as if making sure they weren't overheard. "I didn't know who else to call." Andrew crossed his arms, concern etched into his face. "What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jason exhaled sharply and handed Andrew his phone. On the screen was an email, unsigned, from an anonymous address, but its contents were chilling. "You've taken too much for too long. It's time to pay." Andrew's brow furrowed as he read it. "Do you know who sent this?" Jason shook his head. "Not exactly, but I have a good idea. It's not the first time I've been threatened. When you run in certain circles, enemies come with the territory. But this?" He trailed off, his gaze dropping. "This feels personal." Jason explained that the email was one of several he'd received over the past few days. While he was no stranger to corporate rivalries and cutthroat tactics, the tone of these messages had escalated from vague warnings to outright threats. He suspected one of his former business partners, someone he had outmaneuvered during a high-stakes acquisition, might be behind it. "I don't know if they're serious or just trying to scare me," Jason admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But I can't ignore it." Andrew leaned forward, his voice steady. "Have you gone to the police?" Jason grimaced. "Not yet. If it's just a scare tactic, I don't want to make it worse by overreacting. But I needed to talk to someone who might see this for what it is." Andrew glanced at the email again, his mind racing. He didn't know much about Jason's past dealings, but he could see the fear in his eyes, the kind of fear that came from realizing your actions might have real, dangerous consequences. "I think you should take this seriously," Andrew said. "Even if it's a bluff, it's better to be safe than sorry." Jason nodded reluctantly. "I was afraid you'd say that." The following week was tense. Jason began taking precautions, hiring private security, avoiding his usual routines, but the unease lingered. Despite his efforts to downplay the situation, Andrew could see the strain it was taking on him. The once confident businessman now seemed to look over his shoulder constantly, his recovery overshadowed by a sense of dread. Then came the breaking point. Andrew was leaving the hospital late one evening when he spotted Jason in the parking lot. Jason was leaning against his car, his face pale and his breath coming in short bursts. "What happened?" Andrew asked, rushing to his side. Jason held up his phone, his hand trembling. On the screen was a photo of him entering the hospital earlier that day, accompanied by another chilling message. "We're closer than you think." Andrew felt his stomach drop. "Jason, this isn't just a scare tactic anymore. Whoever this is, they're watching you." Jason nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know. And I don't know how to stop it." Determined to help, Andrew accompanied Jason back to his apartment that night, insisting he not be alone. Jason's penthouse, usually a sanctuary of luxury and calm, now felt cold and foreboding. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound a potential danger. As they sat in the living room, Jason opened up about the cutthroat world he had once thrived in. He spoke of deals made and bridges burned, of alliances forged and shattered. It was a world where power was everything and loyalty was often bought, not earned. "I thought I was untouchable," Jason admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I never stopped to think about the people I might hurt along the way." Andrew leaned forward, his gaze steady. "And now?" Jason met his eyes, the vulnerability in his expression unmistakable. "Now I'm realizing how wrong I was." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of glass shattering. Both men froze, their heads snapping toward the direction of the noise. A moment later, the apartment's security alarm blared, its shrill wail cutting through the silence. "Stay here," Andrew said, already moving toward the source of the commotion. "Andrew, wait," Jason began, but Andrew was already out of sight. In the kitchen, Andrew found the cause of the alarm. A brick lying on the floor amidst shards of glass from the broken window. Attached to it was a note, hastily scrawled in bold, angry letters. "This is your final warning." Before Andrew could react, a figure appeared outside the broken window, a shadowy silhouette that disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Adrenaline surged through Andrew as he reached for his phone to call the police. The police arrived quickly, combing the area for any sign of the intruder. Though they didn't find anyone, they took the threat seriously and advised Jason to stay somewhere secure for the time being. That night, Andrew stayed by Jason's side, refusing to leave him alone. As the hours ticked by, Jason's usual bravado gave way to a quiet vulnerability. "Why are you doing this?" Jason asked softly. "You don't owe me anything." Andrew looked at him, his expression calm but firm. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I believe in second chances." Jason's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't deserve this." Andrew smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But you're trying to be better, and that counts for something." The next morning, Jason took Andrew's advice and hired professional security to monitor his apartment and his movements. He also contacted the police to formally report the threats, providing them with all the emails and messages he had received. Though the immediate danger seemed to subside, the experience left a lasting impression on Jason. It forced him to confront the consequences of his past actions in a way he never had before. And for Andrew, it was a reminder of the power of integrity and loyalty, even in the face of danger. Their bond, forged through hardship and redemption, was stronger than ever. And though the shadows of Jason's past still loomed, they both knew they would face them together. The city was cloaked in the muted gray of a rainy evening, and Jason's apartment felt unusually quiet. It had been weeks since the threats began, and while the visible danger seemed to have subsided, the sense of unease hadn't left either Jason or Andrew. Jason's newly hired security detail patrolled the building, their presence both a comfort and a grim reminder of the lurking menace. Andrew had stopped by after his shift at the hospital, as he often did now, to check on Jason. The two men sat in the spacious living room, the faint sound of rain tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Jason was unusually restless, pacing near the window as Andrew sipped tea on the couch. "I hate feeling like this," Jason said, running a hand through his hair. "Trapped. Helpless. Waiting for something to happen." Andrew set his cup down. "You're not helpless, Jason. You've taken precautions and the police are investigating. That's all you can do for now." Jason paused, his jaw tight. "What if it's not enough?" Andrew stood, his calm demeanor steadying Jason's nervous energy. "Whatever happens, you're not alone. We'll handle it." Jason's gratitude flickered in his expression, but he didn't get the chance to respond. The lights flickered briefly, plunging the apartment into an eerie dimness before stabilizing. Both men froze, their senses on high alert. "Did you see that?" Jason asked, his voice low. Andrew nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Stay here." Andrew moved cautiously through the apartment, his instincts honed by years of working in high-pressure situations. He checked each room, his phone gripped tightly in his hand, ready to call for help if necessary. As he approached the kitchen, he noticed something unusual. The sliding door to the balcony was ajar, rain dripping onto the polished floor. "Jason," Andrew called out, his voice sharp. Jason appeared in the doorway, his crutch in hand. "What is it?" "Someone's been here," Andrew said, motioning toward the door. "Stay back." But before Jason could respond, a shadow moved across the balcony, followed by a sudden crash as the door was thrown open. A masked figure lunged into the room, their movements quick and deliberate. Andrew reacted instinctively, positioning himself between the intruder and Jason. "Get out," he shouted, his voice firm and unwavering. The figure hesitated for a split second, clearly not expecting resistance. Then they advanced, brandishing a knife. Andrew grabbed a nearby chair and swung it, forcing the intruder to stumble backward. "Jason, call the police," Andrew yelled, his adrenaline surging. Jason fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed. The intruder, regaining their footing, lunged again. Andrew sidestepped, using the chair to block the attack, but the sharp edge of the blade nicked his arm, drawing blood. The pain was sharp but fleeting, overshadowed by Andrew's determination to protect Jason. He managed to knock the knife from the intruder's hand, sending it skittering across the floor. The sound of Jason shouting into the phone for help filled the air. The fight felt endless, each moment stretched by the adrenaline coursing through Andrew's veins. Finally, a pounding on the front door signaled the arrival of the building's security team. The intruder, realizing the odds had turned, scrambled toward the balcony and disappeared into the stormy night. Andrew slumped against the counter, his chest heaving. Blood seeped from the shallow cut on his arm, staining the sleeve of his scrubs. Jason hurried to his side, his face pale with worry. "You're hurt," Jason said, his voice trembling. "Let me get something." "I'm fine," Andrew interrupted, waving him off. "What about you? Are you okay?" Jason nodded, his expression dazed. "I'm fine, thanks to you." The security team entered moments later, their radios crackling as they surveyed the scene. Andrew explained what had happened as paramedics arrived to tend to his wound. Jason stayed close by, his gratitude evident in every glance. Later, as the apartment finally quieted, Jason sat beside Andrew on the couch. The bandage on Andrew's arm was a stark reminder of the night's events, but his calm demeanor hadn't wavered. "You could have been killed," Jason said, his voice thick with emotion. Andrew looked at him, his expression steady. "So could you?" Jason exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the edge of the couch. "Why would you do that? Why would you put yourself in danger for me?" Andrew smiled faintly. "Because it was the right thing to do. And because I care." Jason's eyes glistened, his usual stoicism crumbling. "I don't deserve your loyalty. After everything I've done?" "Stop," Andrew said firmly. "You're not that person anymore. You've changed. And everyone deserves someone in their corner." Jason nodded, his gratitude overwhelming him. "Thank you, Andrew. For everything." In the days that followed, the police investigation intensified, and the security around Jason's building was reinforced. The intruder was identified as a hired thug, likely sent by one of Jason's business rivals, though the trail went cold before the mastermind could be uncovered. Despite the lingering uncertainty, Jason began to rebuild his sense of safety. And through it all, Andrew remained by his side, a steadfast presence who had proven his loyalty in the most harrowing of circumstances. For Jason, the night of the attack marked a turning point. It wasn't just about survival, it was about realizing the depth of his connection with Andrew. The man he had once humiliated had become his closest ally, a source of strength and integrity that inspired him to be better. And for Andrew, the experience reaffirmed his belief in the power of resilience and redemption. Jason was still a work in progress, but he was on the right path. And Andrew was proud to walk that path with him, no matter how stormy the road ahead might be. The morning sunlight poured into the rehabilitation center's courtyard, casting a golden glow over the manicured garden. Jason Parker, dressed in casual yet sharp attire, walked unassisted for the first time in months. His limp was barely noticeable, a testament to weeks of grueling physical therapy and unwavering determination. But the changes in Jason ran deeper than the physical. He carried himself differently now, his once rigid posture softened by humility. Andrew stood nearby, leaning against a railing, watching as Jason completed a lap around the garden. A smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Not bad," Andrew said as Jason approached. "Another lap and I might actually be impressed." Jason chuckled, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Don't get used to this. I'm still figuring out how to be a normal person again." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "You're doing better than most?" Jason's smile faded slightly, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "That's because I had the right people helping me." As Jason transitioned back to his life outside the hospital, he made a conscious effort to approach his work and relationships differently. Gone were the days of relentless ambition and cold detachment. Instead, he focused on building genuine connections and giving back to the community that had supported him during his recovery. One of Jason's first public acts of redemption came in the form of a press conference. Standing in front of a small group of reporters and colleagues, Jason spoke candidly about his experiences. "I've spent most of my life chasing success at any cost," Jason admitted, his voice steady but vulnerable. "And in doing so, I hurt people, directly and indirectly. But the past few months have taught me that success means nothing if you lose sight of what really matters. Integrity, empathy, and the people who stand by you when everything else falls apart." The audience listened intently as Jason announced a new initiative, a foundation dedicated to supporting small businesses and individuals impacted by corporate malfeasance. The announcement was met with applause, and Jason's team quickly began implementing his vision. Back at the hospital, Andrew watched the press conference from the break room, a rare moment of pride swelling in his chest. He had seen Jason's transformation firsthand, but hearing him publicly acknowledge his mistakes was something else entirely. Samantha, a fellow nursing assistant, entered the room and caught sight of the broadcast. "Isn't that the guy you've been helping?" she asked, nodding toward the screen. Andrew nodded. "That's him." She gave him a curious look. "You really made an impression on him?" Andrew shrugged, though his smile betrayed his pride. "He did the hard part. I just pointed him in the right direction." True to his word, Jason also sought to make amends with Andrew on a personal level. One evening, he invited Andrew to dinner at a modest but cozy restaurant. Over a meal that felt more like a conversation between old friends than a business meeting, Jason broached the topic of Andrew's future. "You've been helping people for as long as I've known you," Jason said, leaning forward. "But what about your dreams? What do you want to do?" Andrew hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I've been focused on the present for so long, I haven't really thought about it." Jason smiled knowingly. "Then maybe it's time you did." He reached into his pocket and handed Andrew an envelope. Inside was a check, a substantial amount, enough to cover tuition for nursing school or any other path Andrew might choose to pursue. Andrew stared at the check, his throat tight with emotion. "Jason, I can't accept this." Jason shook his head. "You can and you will. This isn't charity, Andrew. It's an investment. You believed in me when no one else did. Now it's my turn to believe in you." Andrew met Jason's gaze, the sincerity in his eyes leaving no room for argument. "Thank you," Andrew said softly. "This means more than I can say." Over the next few months, Jason continued to rebuild his life with a renewed sense of purpose. He reconnected with old friends, mended broken relationships, and even volunteered at the hospital where he had spent so much time recovering. His foundation quickly gained traction, supporting countless individuals and earning him the respect of a community that had once viewed him with skepticism. For Andrew, the funds Jason provided opened doors he had never thought possible. He enrolled in an advanced nursing program, balancing his coursework with his job at the hospital. Though the workload was demanding, Andrew approached it with the same resilience and determination that had carried him through his toughest days. One evening, as Andrew reviewed class notes in the hospital's break room, his phone buzzed with a message from Jason. "Dinner tonight? I got an idea I want to run by you." Curious, Andrew agreed. That night, Jason unveiled his latest project, a mentorship program designed to connect professionals with individuals striving to overcome challenges in their careers. "I was thinking about all the people who helped me get here," Jason explained. "You, the staff at the hospital, even some of my colleagues. This program would be a way to pass that support forward." Andrew smiled, the excitement in Jason's voice infectious. "It sounds like a great idea. Count me in." Jason's grin widened. "I was hoping you'd say that." As the weeks turned into months, the lives of both men became intertwined not through obligation, but through mutual respect and friendship. Jason's journey from arrogance to redemption was a testament to the power of resilience, and Andrew's unwavering support served as a reminder that integrity could inspire even the most unlikely transformations. One afternoon, as they stood on the steps of the hospital after a charity event, Jason turned to Andrew, his expression earnest. "I wouldn't be here without you." Andrew laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "You got here on your own. I just made sure you didn't take too many wrong turns." Jason chuckled, but his gratitude remained evident. "Well, here's to second chances." Andrew nodded, his smile warm. "And making the most of them." As the sun set over the city, the two men walked away together, their paths forever changed by the storm they had weathered, and the bond they had forged along the way. The morning was crisp and filled with promise as Andrew walked across the college campus. A soft breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, mingling with the hum of student chatter. The advanced nursing program was everything he had hoped for, and more challenging than he had anticipated. Yet he embraced every class, every assignment, knowing each step brought him closer to his dream. His phone buzzed with a message from Jason. "How's the future nurse of the year doing? Coffee after class?" Andrew smiled, shaking his head at Jason's insistence on celebrating his progress at every turn. "See you at 4," he replied, pocketing his phone before heading into a lecture hall. Meanwhile, Jason stood in the newly opened office of his mentorship program, reviewing applications. The room buzzed with energy as his team worked to match mentors with ments. The foundation was thriving, and Jason's reputation had transformed from a cold corporate shark to a respected philanthropist. One of his assistants knocked gently on the door. "We just got a call from the hospital. They're requesting another grant for equipment upgrades." Jason leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful smile on his face. "Make it happen," he said. "And let's schedule a visit. I want to see how the funds are being used." As the assistant left, Jason's gaze lingered on a photo on his desk, a picture of him and Andrew at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the foundation. The memory filled him with gratitude. His journey had taken him through storms of his own making, but it had also led him to connections that would anchor him for life. Later that afternoon, Andrew and Jason met at a small cafe near the hospital. It was one of their favorite spots, a quiet retreat where they often discussed their lives, goals, and the lessons they had learned along the way. "So, how's the mentorship program going?" Andrew asked, sipping his coffee. "Better than I imagined," Jason said, his eyes lighting up. "We've already helped dozens of people. And get this, one of the ments just landed a job at a tech startup." He said his mentor completely changed his perspective. Andrew grinned. "That's incredible. You're really making a difference." Jason tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "I had a good example to follow." Andrew rolled his eyes. "You give me too much credit?" Jason leaned forward, his tone sincere. "I don't think I give you enough. If it weren't for you, I'd still be stuck in my old ways, thinking money and power were all that mattered." Andrew set his cup down, meeting Jason's gaze. "And if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here either. We've both come a long way." Jason smiled, raising his coffee cup. "To unlikely friendships." Andrew clinked his cup against Jason's. "And to what comes next?" What came next was a continuation of their shared growth. Andrew excelled in his program, his dedication earning him accolades from both professors and peers. On the day of his graduation, Jason was there in the audience, cheering louder than anyone else. "You did it," Jason said proudly as he handed Andrew a small box after the ceremony. Inside was a sleek nameplate that read, "Andrew Miller, RN." Andrew laughed, shaking his head. "You're relentless." Jason shrugged, a grin on his face. "You've earned it." For Jason, life took on a richness he had never experienced before. The mentorship program expanded, and his foundation became a beacon of hope for those seeking second chances. He even began speaking at events, sharing his story of redemption to inspire others. At one such event, he glanced at Andrew, who sat in the front row, and spoke words that had become his mantra. "The choices we make define us, but the people who believe in us when we falter? They're the reason we find the strength to change." Years later, on a warm spring evening, Andrew and Jason found themselves back at the cafe where so many of their conversations had taken place. The mentorship program was celebrating its 5th anniversary, and the city had just awarded Jason a Community Impact Award. Andrew lifted his glass of iced tea. "Here's to the man who went from king of the boardroom to king of the community," Jason laughed. "And here's to the man who always saw more in me than I deserved." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city lights flicker to life. The storm that had once overshadowed their lives had long since passed, leaving behind a bond that neither man had expected but both had come to treasure. "I think we turned out all right," Jason said, his voice tinged with contentment. Andrew nodded, a smile on his face. "More than all right." As the evening wore on, they talked about the future, not with the urgency of men seeking redemption, but with the quiet confidence of those who had found it. Their paths, once so different, had converged in a way neither could have foreseen. And in that convergence, they had discovered not just friendship, but the profound truth that even the unlikeliest connections could change lives for the better. At the mentorship program's headquarters, a plaque hung on the wall near the entrance. Inscribed were the words, "Redemption is not an endpoint but a journey, a chance to rebuild, to reconnect, and to make the world better for having lived in it." Below it, 2 names stood side by side, Jason Parker and Andrew Miller. Their legacy, built on resilience and integrity, would inspire countless others to seek their own second chances. And for Jason and Andrew, their journey was a reminder that sometimes, the greatest transformations began with the simplest acts of kindness. What do you think about the transformation of Jason and Andrew's bond? If you were in Andrew's position, would you have been able to forgive Jason and stand by him despite his past actions? Similarly, do you think Jason's efforts to make amends were enough, or was there more he could have done to address his past mistakes? We'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done differently in their situation? If this story of resilience, redemption, and unexpected friendships touched your heart, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more moving narratives that explore the depths of human emotions. Your feedback and perspectives mean the world to us, so share your thoughts in the comments below.